Aloha! Welcome to K-Dub's Place. It's April 26th, 2016. My name is Kenny Wilson. I will be the host for the duration of this transmission. As usual, we're going to be doing some reading from a book entitled It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time, The Real-Life Antics of a 20th Century Kid. And tonight we're going to be taking a few things from the 90s chapter. Some things that happened over here on Kauai back in those 1990 kind of days. And as usual, we're going to have some music behind the storytelling. And so what you're hearing now is going to be this recording I did back on July 20th of 2012. And I was in St. Louis at the time, and the reason I bring it up is it just brought this horrible recording memory back. I got up that morning and I was off work at St. Louis. Did I say I was in St. Louis? I was going to the Clayton Recording Studios to work with my friend Alex Jones on stuff. I was just going to be playing just some piano and vocal, maybe do a little harmony, no other instruments, possibly building on it later, a bunch of cover songs. It wasn't any pressure. It's just when I'm looking for a good time, I go to a recording studio. So that's what I was doing. So I woke up that morning and I was feeling pretty good. I was, okay, let's play some music. And so got the coffee and the orange juice going and made the mistake of turning on the television. First thing I saw was first and last thing I saw on the television before I went to the studio was all the coverage of the Aurora, Colorado theater mass killing, shooting, tragedy, horrible event that happened that night before. And it hit me. It really hit me, and all of a sudden, woke up in a great mood. And it just tore, and I just sit there and stared at all this stuff. Like one always does, I just, and all of a sudden, a couple hours later, gotta be at the studio. I couldn't cancel the recording session because, hey, sorry, pal, the news really bummed me out today, and I can't do the session. I'm not gonna do that. So I go to the recording session, but I get there and I'm sitting at the piano and he's got everything set up, and so I'm sitting there staring out into the space and couldn't remember I didn't know what I was there for. I just could not focus on the music or what I was doing. I ended up playing songs I didn't mean to play. I didn't play ones I really wanted to play. Things, I did some bad playing. And anyway, I decided to throw that in, which affected this whole recording I did. And okay, anyway, we have much more happier and funny, I would hope, things to get to. So let's do that. Okay, here. Now, this next episode might not strike you as being funny. You might think it's kind of pathetic. But it's okay, because every time I read it, I get a laugh. Okay, here we go. Okay, now the setup, this is kind of short, so I gotta give you a setup. I had been in D.C. and Virginia, and I kind of went crazy, and then it was gonna split. So I went out to L.A. for about 5 months, and then a lot of other things happened. It was right before I got to Kauai initially. So I'm here in Southern California. That's where the story is at this point, and my life is a complete mess. Not just a little bit of a mess. I've always got a little mess going on, following me around. But this was, okay, here we go. So I'm in California. One thing that happened fairly early in my stay there took place at Stephen Karm's place. I think at the time they were residing in Riverside, California, and I was hanging out there for a while. I remember one morning, probably fairly late in the morning, I had just risen from my slumber and ventured out into the primary living area of the house, at which time I encountered Carm, who cordially asked me if I'd mind watching young Paul, who had been born the year before, for a bit while she made a quick trip to the store. She had just changed the young lad and said, nothing should be a problem, and that we could just hang out, have some fun, and that she would return shortly. Seemed like a piece of cake at the time. I, of course, said for sure, seeing as how I had, through some systematic Catholic dealings, been anointed to be godfather of the young lad. I know they didn't base this decision on practical matters, but there I was, a godfather. How could I say no? And of course, I wouldn't have anyway. So she went out to the outdoor, and I was there laughing and making funny faces at my new nephew. He's about 1 year old at this point. About 2 minutes after her departure, I started detecting a bit of concern on young Paul's face, as I was trying to make him laugh with my ridiculous antics. All of a sudden, I started detecting a faint aroma of, well, how can I politely say it? A scent of baby shit coming through the fine apparel he was wearing at the time. I decided to wait it out. All of a sudden, I started feeling a bit of apprehension in my stomach and my immediate future. Well, I was banking on the thought that Carm would be coming home soon, but she had just left about 10 minutes ago, so my concern deepened. I put it off for as long as I could, but at some point there started to be a slow oozing bunch of shit coming off the top of those Pampers that he was sporting at the time. It was as if he had been holding back for quite a while, just for my benefit. It was a huge bit of crapping going on, that's for sure. Oh, did I forget to tell you? I had never changed the diapers of a baby in my life. Well, I'm not usually too intimidated by an adventure out in front of me, but this was different somehow. So I let it go on as long as I could, but eventually Paul started to draw my attention to the problem. I knew I had to act fast. I knew where the room was, where the next thing should take place, but that was about it. Paul was only 1 year old, and okay, I saw the Pampers. Thank goodness that people weren't still using washable cloth diapers and fastening pins, or I would have been royally screwed. Paul too, probably. Okay, where are we here? Okay, here we go. Fortunately, we were living in the latter part of the 20th century, and it should have been fairly easy a mission to complete. But even with the comforts of our current society, I was scared beyond belief. I lifted the young lad on top of this table that seemed to be built for the occasion, and proceeded to try to figure out what must be done next. The funniest thing about this incident was, as scared as I was about the whole thing, young Paul led me through the whole process. Yeah, I didn't even know quite what to do about the fastening of the Pampers, but he, to his incredible credit, showed me where to do that. And finally, after the most traumatic moment of my life, all was accomplished. And it was a perfect picture of domestic success. The next problem, which is probably the most important, was where do I put the big glop of poo-poo Pampers? I was walking around the house frantically trying to figure out the answer to that question when, miracle of miracles, Carm walked through the door. There I was, standing with a bunch of shit in my hands, and of course, there was a very obvious place to put such a thing, but I was mystified. And of course, after the initial apprehension and concern, Paul was pretty much laughing at the whole thing. Amen. Okay. I don't generally get depressed much, and if it falls upon me, it doesn't last more than a day or two. As I write this little tale, I'm somewhere during my 60th year, and the last few years, there have been those around me who think I'm living in denial about this, that is the depression thing. Because I have harbored notions of ending my time here on Earth a couple of different times. At those times, I really believed it was just a case of having good manners and common sense. However, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I do feel sadness when someone close to me dies or is in much pain. I even feel sadness when I hear something of that nature in the news. But depression is not a regular visitor to my door, regardless of the trouble I may have created for myself at any given time. But I do remember an evening, probably in late 1996, when the blues had descended upon my being and I ended up moping around a little bit. I probably couldn't really afford it, but I decided to treat myself to a nice meal and a couple glasses of wine, which usually made me feel better about things when this sort of situation presented itself. So I took myself down to the old bull shed for a steak, potato, salad, and red wine feast. And I knew a bunch of the employees of this particular establishment, so it was a place of familiarity and comfort. When I got to the hostess station, I requested one of the small tables near a window so that I could stare out at the lovely Kauai night sky and let my imagination take me flying far away from whatever the problem was at the moment. Of course, where was it? Of course, a glass of wine can generally do the same thing. I believe the moon was full as well, which always enhances the experience, whatever it may be. Immediately outside my window was a putting green, as in golf, which was there for the recreation of the tourists that were staying at the tourist lodgings next door. And as the first glass of wine was delivered to me, I began to see a drama unfold right before my eyes on that putting green. And it's one that I'll never forget. A pouring of rain had just ceased, and though the sun was going down, it was still light enough for children to be out and about, as was the case on the putting green. The characters that starred in this drama of epic proportions was a simple cast indeed, and included a brothers and sister act, the oldest being around 10, one of the boys, the next about 7, the girl, and another boy around 5 years old. And add to the cast, a 5-gallon bucket and dozens upon dozens of frogs that seemed to appear out of nowhere, kind of like that movie Magnolia. And you've got quite a recipe for glorious entertainment. You see, there are a million frogs that call Kauai their home. They have a tendency to come out of their hiding places after a healthy rain. This is most noticeable when you're driving your car down a quiet country road at night, and there they are, staring you down, waiting for you to give it your best shot. And no matter how you try to not hit the little buggers, they always find a way to get one of their gang to find a place between the road and your wheel, and squish goes the froggy. And then there's the one guy who's by himself in the middle of the road just daring you. Of course, when you decide that the safest way for the frog for you to maneuver is to go right over him so that he doesn't get it with your wheel spinning over him, he decides to just jump up at the precise moment that your vehicle is directly over his little body and well, that version doesn't end up much better for your frog friend either. Anyway, somehow a large tribe of frogs had descended on this putting green, and there was only one thing that could come next, if these rambunctious children had anything to do with it. Well, it started out with a simple chasing of the frogs around the green by the trio of kids. The little girl even got into it when it was just chasing. However, at some point it was going to be necessary and inevitable for the 10-year-old boy to pick up one of those little creatures and stick in his sister's face, which of course resulted in a bit of a scream and the running in circles and such. She acted like she was going to blow the scene altogether when this new tact of her brother's commenced, but by the look in her face, you knew she really didn't want to go anywhere and leave all the action behind. Of course, the older kid did the same thing to the little guy, but the 5-year-old took it like a man and just laughed hysterically. As all the frogs started freaking out, some of them hopped into the holes where on a nice sunny day golf balls would be putted into. So then a little game got going, which entailed trying to find the holes with a frog or two in it and racking up the score. Of course, the big kid was faster on his feet and with his calculations of arithmetic, so the others really had no chance to compete effectively. Soon enough, the tracking down of the frogs in the putting holes became a bore, and the crew needed to heighten the excitement. I'm not sure how the older kid pulled this out of his hat, but all of a sudden he showed up with an empty 5-gallon bucket and instructed his siblings to start corralling up as many frogs as possible to fill up the bucket with. The young lady wasn't about to actually put her hands on one of those things, but she did run around as if to be actually driving those frogs in an intended direction. The little guy finally got the nerve to pick one up himself, and of course after the ice had been broken, he became enthralled with the task and became quite a capable frog hand. Or would that be frog boy? Yeah. Anyway, during it all, the older brother copped quite a maniacal look on his face and took his little brother off the corralling chore so he could act as a prison guard of the bucket prison, while the boss collected more frogs than I've ever known a human to be able to do. Of course, all of this time, the frogs had a look in their bulging eyes that gave away a feeling of being scared shitless, as Mr. Stills would say, with impending doom waiting for them in this bucket of their buddies piled on top of each other. The frogs, to their credit, didn't just lay down and die. Rather, they tried very valiantly to escape from the bucket prison. But by now, the younger boy didn't need any instruction or inspiration to become one mighty jailer, and made sure that none of those pesky amphibians got anywhere near the top of their common cell. The girl, meanwhile, kept running in circles with a sound coming from her mouth that I can only describe as screaming laughter. At some point, the bucket became so full that the little guy couldn't keep up with getting each and every one of these things back in their hold. And when the big brother saw this, he went over, knocked over the bucket, and the three kids ran off screaming and laughing to beat the band. But the frogs gave them some healthy competition in fleeing the premises. And when the dusk had cleared, there was only a lonely bucket turned on its side on the putting green, with no one left to play with it. And to my total amazement, every frog lived long enough to get out of there on their own four legs. The simplicity and the magnificence of those kids' rapture in the funhouse they had created was overwhelming to me, especially in the state I was in upon entering the restaurant. I was smitten with the glory of childhood and life in general, and ever since then, whenever I get ready to come up with a title for one of my musical albums, even though I haven't used it yet, the first thing that comes to mind is A Bucket of Frogs. Well, maybe the next one. Ha! Anyway, actually that was back 2 years ago when I was writing this thing. And I have a new collection of songs. It's kind of my little best of kind of things, or at least my favorites. And it's called A Bucket of Frogs. And you can find it on CD, baby. Yes. And you can even just go to my YouTube thing and see it for free. And listen to it, of course. Okay, be right back with more fun. Okay, I'd really like to read something from the chapter called Purgatory. Now, I like to... hard to explain this period of time. But it was 1981. I think I got to LA at the end of January of 81. And then I stayed until I flew to Kauai in June. So we're looking at, 5 months, something like that. But it was a rough period of time. Well, the chapter's called Purgatory, if that says anything to you. Anyway, I was up at my Aunt Jerry's place, and here's what we got here. During the time that I spent at their place during the spring of 81, I can't imagine that I had a whole lot to do to keep myself busy. Their house is pretty much out in the middle of nowhere as far as other human contact goes, and I wasn't about to hike all over those snake-infested hills like I enjoyed doing so in my youth. I seem to recall a Tom Clancy book sitting around, and that must have been when I started taking an interest in his stuff. Although his stories are a bit technically over-detailed, I've always been entertained by the scenarios. Other than the use of their piano, I'm at a loss as to my daytime activities. I do remember on a Friday night, while seated at the dinner table, my Uncle Phil had a suggestion as to what I might do for entertainment that evening. Well, up at the top of their driveway and down the road a few steps was, and it may still be there as far as I know, a place called the Saddle Peak Lodge, which is a bit of a historic landmark in the neighborhood throughout the years. At this point in time, it was a nice steakhouse with fine dining for all those concerned. Occasionally, it would host some live music on weekend nights. Apparently, this is the case when I was staying there. Uncle Phil didn't have much nice to say about the situation because apparently the raucous nature of the establishment would find its way down to the ears of my lovely hosts. And as displeased as he was with the situation, he thought it might be right down my alley, so he offered it up. And always being up for a little live music, I ventured up the hill to see what the fuss was all about. As I approached this den of iniquity, I heard sounds that made me feel comfortable, and yet knew exactly what my uncle was talking about as far as his feelings on the subject went. It seemed like it was a pretty packed house, and that the patrons inside were whooping it up big time. When I stepped through the door, I heard a better-than-average rock and roll band churning up the festive brew for the folks inside. When I made it to the entrance of the bar, which is where the music was emanating from, I looked around to size up the situation, and I started to notice a few familiar faces in the crowd. The first one I saw was a guy named Glenn Fry, who has been with the Eagles since that band got together, seated at the bar and having a libation of some kind while having conversation with none other than Booker T. Booker T, of course, of Booker T and the MG's fame. I thought Mike Campbell of Tom Petty's gang might even have been there. But I wasn't that in tune with the Heartbreakers at that point, although I did catch the Damn Torpedoes tour while back in Virginia. And after I got myself a brew and was standing in the back, I turned around to the entrance that I had just been through, and I saw Bonnie Raitt and Delbert McClinton standing there, chatting away with some other cat. Now, kind of like the Mike Campbell thing, I started to think that everybody there was looking like some kind of famous human being from the world of rock and roll. Anyway, it seems like it's times like this that one thing comes to mind. It was time for me to spring into action. I finished the beer and went back to my place of residence for the evening, and although I didn't have much in the way of material possessions at this point in my life, I did have a bunch of my Kenny Wilson vinyl albums, that I was carting around with me in my travels. I grabbed a bunch of these artifacts and headed back to the corral. When I got back there, I handed out whatever I brought with me and even stopped to chat with Bonnie and Delbert a bit. I dropped a few names of my pals back in D.C. that they'd be familiar with, which they were. McClinton used to play Desperados every once in a while passing through that town. And both he and Bonnie knew Catfish Hodge, who had moved into my house on the hill when I split, who I believe was doing gigs at the time with some of the guys from Little Feat under the name of Chicken Legs. Yeah, I may never have been very good at selling those albums, but I sure knew how to hand them out. Having accomplished my mission, I settled into a couple of more beers and took in the scene for a while longer. I stayed long enough to catch Booker T jam with the band a bit and then carried myself home for the evening. The next day, my aunt and uncle asked me how it had gone the night before. I told them I had had a good time, but didn't go into the details because I was pretty sure they wouldn't know who any of these people were anyway. That night, it being Saturday, I ventured back up to the Saddle Peak at the top of the hill to see what would happen next. When I got there, it was pretty much dead. I don't even think that the band that had been rocking the night before was even present. It was like there had been a rock star flash mob 24 hours ago. Gee, I don't know. Maybe it was a dream. Okay, so a little earlier, as we were beginning, actually, I said that these little stories that I was going to read were coming from the 90s chapter, and of course, I ended up being quite mistaken. The one about the bucket of frogs, that was definitely a 90s thing. But the rest of these stories are in a chapter, as I mentioned earlier, called Purgatory. It came right after me leaving Northern Virginia after having basically I had my years growing up kind of around that place, but things got a little wacky at the end, and so I just decided to evacuate. And so I drove out to Los Angeles from where I came from, and I lasted about 4 or 5 months out there before I eventually came to Kauai, which of course was much pleasanter than anything I had experienced, at least in that recent past. So I'm gonna just read this first part of the Purgatory thing. It's just like a paragraph or something. There we go. Okay, this is the first words in the Purgatory chapter. In trying to figure out if I've chosen the right word for the title of this chapter, I started doing a little research on its meaning, and unless I talk myself out of it while I'm discussing it here on this page, I plan on keeping it. It's a reference used by the Catholic Church regarding the expiations. It's a reference used by the Catholic Church regarding the expiation of sins, for the most part. But seeing as how I can't relate to that aspect of it, and yet still believe it suits my purposes in the secular world that I live in, I'll try to explain it in as coherent a way as possible so that hopefully the man and woman on the street can understand what I'm talking about and how it seems to be the perfect word for my title. Of course, there's always the chance that I might change my mind after going through the events that transpired between January 20th, 1981 and June of that same year. But this is my book, so I believe it's my prerogative. Woe is me! What have I done? How can I redeem myself in my own eyes, at least? Okay, that ought to cover it. That explains the purgatory thing for everyone. Now, where was I here? Oh yeah, so at the same time that I was having a low mark in my life, my father was going through somewhat of a parallel universe himself. He was, well, let me see, I'd have to read the rest of that chapter before that to properly explain, but he and I weren't doing very good at all. Not so much with each other yet, but individually, it was a couple of our worst times in our respective lives, I believe. Anyway, so I had been there for, I don't know, 3 or 4 months or something. I think the decision had been made to go to Kauai already, but I'm not sure. But we're going to go through this little episode here, which I'm not really proud of, but basically it's the big fight that my father and I had on a Saturday night in the Cockatoo Lounge. Okay, here we go. So, where was I? Oh yeah, so my dad was coming into town for a few days to finalize the move out of his apartment, and the plan was that I would meet him and hang out for a few days with him. He had been to LA at least one other time while I was there in early '81, and we had spent time together then as well. I do remember he and I going to some meeting downtown with Jack Palance's brother, of all people. I think it had something to do with some kind of lobbying that my dad was trying to set up with this guy for some kind of project that he hoped to make money on. I seem to recall that the thing never panned out. Oh well. My father and I were at the time going through a kind of parallel universe as far as our emotional and mental stability were involved, with both hitting an all-time low for both of us. So even if it gave us some common ground to pace around on, it really wasn't a great combination that might yield good things. When you're down and out, it isn't really too bright to go to someone else who's down and out for assistance or even good counsel. So there we were, a chemistry project awaiting to explode. Now, the Cockatoo Inn has a pretty notorious rep in LA history. It's located, or it used to be, at the corner of Hawthorne and Imperial in close proximity to both the airport and the Hollywood Park racetrack. It sits pretty much in the middle of what used to be the 31st Congressional District of California, which is the district that Dad represented in D.C. for 18 years. It was built in the 50s by a reputed mafia figure named Andrew Lococo, who eventually was busted by the feds in the early 60s for some sort of gangster dealings. Since its opening, it has always been known as a restaurant of fine dining and acted as a sort of hotel with 210 guest rooms, a number of meeting rooms for conferences, political fundraisers, and such. And the bar was what one might call a hot spot, frequented by underworld figures, jockeys, and horse trainers from the track, local politicians, and ladies of the night, if you know what I mean. There's been said that a secret tunnel that went from the kitchen back to the guest rooms so as to discreetly transport said beauties and their newfound men of the night from the bar to their logical destination. Apparently JFK, RFK, and the pilots of Air Force One spent some time there when passing through town, including a little rendezvous with one Marilyn Monroe on at least one occasion. After its founder, Mr. Lococo, got popped, it was taken over by investors of some sort and kept rocking through the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Then a recession came into town, and the aerospace industry, which had brought throngs of employees into the area, took a hard hit, which resulted in the deterioration of the surrounding neighborhoods. Long after its heyday, the bar appeared in a scene with Pam Grier and Samuel Jackson in Jackie Brown, a movie I've always enjoyed, not only because of my appreciation of Tarantino films, but primarily because its scenes take place in a lot of familiar locations, which are primarily set in what used to be my dad's district and stomping ground. Anyway, this is what used to be his number one watering hole and where he would hold court as the highest ranking political figure that would be there on a regular basis. There was also the scene, this was also the scene of the biggest fight my father and I ever had on a Saturday night during Cockatoo rush hour. Now, at the time, I was back in Torrance staying with my aunt and uncle. The plan was for my dad to get a room at the Cockatoo and that I would go and stay with him for a couple of nights and do some quality time together before going on to the next chapter, so to speak. And for the last few months, my stepmother had been doing a miraculous job of keeping my dad off the booze, which must have been quite a daunting task, seeing as how he had been a pretty serious drinker ever since I can remember. But she didn't come up with him on this trip to L.A., and when I entered the crowded rocking bar at the Cockatoo, on what I believe was a late Saturday afternoon or early Saturday evening, he was seated by himself at a nice booth with all the crazy activity around him. This was right after the Hollywood Park racetrack had shut down for the day, and the usual mob of racetrack people had congregated for an evening of revelry. My dad had spent the afternoon at the track and already had a pretty good buzz going. The fact that he was sitting by himself with all the hubbub going on was highly unusual for him, because up to not too long ago, this is where he was one of the main guys as far as being the center of attention goes. It was much like the time I found him sitting by himself in the Democratic Club when I went to hang out with him on St. Patrick's Day just the year before, during his political fall from grace back in D.C. And like that other episode, I tried to catch up on the alcohol intake, but he was way out in front of me by more than a length. However, I didn't let that faze me and proceeded to drink heavily myself, which certainly seemed natural for me anyway. Well, I believe it started out as a fairly civil conversation, but probably both of us commiserating with one another about our plights in the current situation. At some point, though, I believe he was the first one to start getting on my case about the shape of my life, which was completely understandable now that I look back on it from here and now. Of course, the problem at that time was that I didn't really care that much about what I was doing wrong. And when he got on this track of berating me, I responded by doing the same thing with him, and before you know it, our horns were locked. And as I'm sure you can imagine, things went downhill from there, and the jockey fell off the horse, so to speak. Due to the heavy alcohol consumption, the rest of our conversation is mostly a blur in my memory banks. I do remember my getting on his case about assisting my three brothers with their collegiate careers while letting me flail in the wind, left to fend for myself in this cruel world. And that was completely ridiculous, of course, because although he did let me choose my own path, he assisted me in more ways than I appreciated at the time, including bailing me out on the big loan that I had taken out to produce that first album. And although it was my decision to do the things that I did after high school, he went far out of his way to help me out in so many ways. I believe this would be referred to as denial. I also remember him going on about my being lazy and misdirected in my feeble attempt to make something out of my musical aspirations. But when I had made the decision to not go to college and head on towards these aspirations, he even said, all right, He said all right, but suggested that if I really wanted to make music my main focus, I should move back to Los Angeles and let him get me some kind of a job with a record company or some other music-related business. His point being that DC wasn't where people headed toward when in search of that golden ring. Of course, LA was the place, and he could be of great assistance in providing me the avenue for my career. And this was back in '71 when he was at the top of his congressional game. Like a fool, I said that I didn't want any help from him and that I was going to stick it out in DC and do it my way. As the great bard would say, the folly of youth. At the Cockatoo, I probably also jabbed him with my accusation of his being a hypocrite when it came to his job and representation of his people. Well, everything got way out of hand, and we ended up yelling at each other at the top of our lungs, which would have been even more embarrassing if the volume of noise in the bar had not been of such a high decibel level. But even with the surrounding noise, we were able to rise above it, and more than a few eyebrows were raised. And who knows what things were said in muffled tones amongst the partying crowd regarding the outcast congressman and his crazy, disrespectful son. Well, at some point we hit the proverbial wall. The alcohol had become too much to deal with, and my dad was losing it, on the verge of passing out. The fact that I had started drinking far later than he turned out to be a good thing, I guess, because I was able to get him out of the booth and basically carried him out of the bar and back to his room. I could only imagine what it looked like to the patrons of this fine establishment to see the humiliated and broken figure of their, until recently, representative in the United States Congress being dragged out by his deranged son. For my part, I was so disgusted with the whole thing that I took him back to his room, dropped him on the bed, and I made it back to Torrance, where I had sought refuge many times before. I don't think I spoke to Dad anymore during his stay in LA. As a matter of fact, I don't think I talked to him at all until the next time we were in each other's presence, which must have been about a month or two later. But then again, we might not have talked then either. We will get to that soon. Okay, that's about all the time we got for K-Dub's place. A little of this or a little of that. We'll stay out of purgatory for a while, but there are a couple tidbits that I do want to return to that chapter for. Anyway, everybody have a lovely rest of the spring, whatever's left, and I'll see you in chapter 10 later on.